So Cynthia shared this passage for us from Acts about how Lydia, who is the first woman named follower of Jesus following Pentecost, I think we could probably consider her to be the first president of the first Women's Society for Christian Service. Any of you are old enough to remember what that organization used to be before United Methodist Women. It was the first women's ministry organization, and certainly Lydia was the head of that organization. The scriptures again directed Paul not to go in one direction, but to go in a different direction towards Macedonia. And they make their way to the Roman provincial capital in Philippi. They don't go first to the places of commerce or public gathering spaces of the leaders and the officials, but they go outside the city, out beyond the boundaries of the city, out by the river where they assumed that there might be a place of prayer. And that's where they found people gathered together. It doesn't say clearly, but one can imagine there might have been some Jews, but probably many, and certainly Lydia appears to be a non-Jewish, Gentile, God-believer or God-fearer, as they were also called. And so meeting there beside the river, they went down to the river to pray. And there God opened Lydia's heart to receive the good news. So my question for you is, when have you found God opening your heart? What have been the times and the situations and those encounters when perhaps surprisingly, not expectedly, not necessarily planned or intended, but surprisingly, serendipitously, providentially, God has opened your heart? Oh, or as John Wesley wrote about his own experience, about his heart being strangely warmed. And again, we have to remember that John Wesley grew up in a very, very religious household. His father was a priest in the Church of England. Both of his grandfathers were priests in the Church of England. His mother was the most amazing Sunday school teacher ever, and she would have lessons with each of her children in turn in the kitchen by the fireside. So he grew up with a very, very rigorous religious education because of her mother's father, her grandfather's connections. He earned a wonderful scholarship to attend a secondary school in London, the charter school, and from there went on to Oxford, studied at Oxford University, probably the preeminent university in the world then and probably still now. His brother Charles later followed him. And at that point, he was rigorously religious, right? And this is where the name Methodism comes from, because he was so methodical, he didn't think you should trifle away any of your time. And so he kept a very, very precise journal, minute by minute, of all of his activities to make sure he wasn't wasting any time. So there was study and there was prayer. There was doing good works, there was gathering together in fellowship, there was visiting the sick and visiting the prisoners, all of this rigorously religious. And then at some point, he felt called to become a missionary, and he, along with his brother Charles, they went on a missionary journey to the American colonies, to Georgia, where they both were utter failures. Utter failures. The originators, the first among our Methodist forebearers, they utterly failed, and not only that, but John was horribly miserable on the sea voyage between England and America, and after a horrible romantic interlude with the daughter of the provincial governor, He had to skedaddle back home again to England and was once again miserable. He didn't understand how the Moravians could be so content when the waves were bashing the ship and the ship was bouncing up and down. He wondered about these Moravians and their faith. And it was some time later, after returning to England, feeling totally miserable as a total failure, feeling like all of his religiousness got him nowhere, that first his brother Charles, and then he too, as he said, went very unwillingly on May 24th, I believe it was 1738. I went very unwillingly to this gathering sponsored by the Moravians at this place called Aldersgate. And it was there, as someone was reading the preface, Luther's preface to the book of Romans, that I found my heart strangely warmed, and I found that I did believe and that I too was saved by God's grace. That was John Wesley's heart-warming experience. He felt his heart strangely opened as Lydia's heart was opened. And while John Wesley and his brother Charles, they themselves did not become missionaries again after that, they trained up and appointed and blessed other missionaries to go to the United States, to go to the American colonies, later the United States. And that good news of Wesleyan salvation by God's grace continued to grow and flourish, including those Wesleyan missionaries who went off to Tonga. So now I'm going to ask to play the second segment of Mafi's interview. And this is kind of more in recent history, and particularly the way in which her personal and family history is woven together with the history of the Wesleyan Church in Tonga, and then how from Tonga it's also grown globally. So let's listen again to ways that hearts have been opened and strangely warmed.
When my mom died in 71, the December of 71, I have two uncles who are pastors. One passed away already. But they had a Bible study at my dad's living room. And so it just developed into a prayer group. And then they start having a little service. And then they start having these church sessions like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and also on Sunday evening. But in the morning, they'll go to the church service in the main church. And so my dad always wanted to start a church, not by him, but the Wesleyan, church to be established in where we grew up, because a lot of young people, and back then you walked to church about a mile. And so the young people, they would just go and drink and didn't go to church. So that was my dad's dream. Anyways, then they expand. A lot of people, they came to it was started in my dad's living room. And so they built a little house on my dad's property, 40 foot or something like that. But it was too close to another church across the street. So they moved it, and then they later on started as a church, built a church and a parsonage and a hall. And from the very beginning, I don't remember how long it took them, but my dad, because I guess it's like what you give to the church, apportionment. Yeah, so whatever they have above the apportionment, my dad would put it in the bank for the church, to build a church someday. And so when they built the church, they didn't have any debt
Mm.
and they didn't have any fundraiser. It's just from people giving. And so my dad, it took years, but my dad was
Mm.
around to see it happen. Yeah, one thing also that in Tonga, they send out missionaries also to other countries, in like Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and there are some Tongan churches established in like US,
Mhm.
New Zealand, Australia, Samoa, Fiji, and Japan. And it happens that my first cousin is the pastor of the church in Japan, Tokyo.
Mm.
When I was in high school, most of my teachers were from Australia, missionaries, or wives of missionaries, or single ladies who were missionaries. So, and that's why, that's how I learned to speak English.
Oh.
Yeah. You are taught when you are in grade school, but not conversation. You-
And the girls' school that you attended was supported by the church?
Yes, yeah. One of the apportionment that that they give at churches, there's a portion there for the schools.
Okay. So it's supported by the apportionments from the local
Yes.
congregation?
Yes. Mhm.
And then your initial position, did you go on for more education before you became a teacher?
Yes, I came to Newburgh. I went to school there in Church Fox, and then I went to Monmouth. It was back then it was Oregon College of Education for my master's, and so I went back and taught. I intended to, go back and taught for the rest of my life, but happened that I got married and came back after 1 year.
So again, we give thanks for the legacy of John and Charles Wesley, for those Wesleyan missionaries, for those who took that seed of the gospel and spread it widely in Tonga, and now for the ways that missionaries from Tonga are serving other communities and other nations as well. And as Mafi has shared with me, many of her cousins are themselves pastors or married to pastors, and the one cousin she mentioned who's currently serving as pastor of the Tongan church in Japan because the Tongan leadership wanted to have a church there in Tokyo for expatriates in Tokyo. So just a wonderful connection, a wonderful networking of faithfulness. So as I begin, so I will conclude. How have you experienced, when have you experienced, where have you experienced God opening your heart or God strangely warming your heart? I think each and every day there are those opportunities available to us, whether it's where we live, whether it's where we might shop, whether it's the people that we might be interacting with online, here at church and elsewhere. I hope and pray that each of us will be open as John and Charles Wesley, as Lydia was in Philippi. So may we too also open our hearts that our hearts might be strangely warmed. Thanks be to God. Amen.